that's not a trained mental health professional. So anybody that's a trained and licensed mental health professional has to adhere to certain ethical and legal bounds around how and when it is justifiable to break confidentiality. And they are very specific instances in most states, and they do vary a little bit by state to state, but in most states, they are limited to instances in which you are posing a serious threat to yourself. Some states it's to yourself and others, so you do need to check on that. Whether you are the victim of or whether you know of an instance of child abuse. And here in the state of Texas, also in the instance of elder abuse. And then the last instance would be if they are subpoenaed by a court of law to testify. And that one also still has some wiggle room in terms of like what actually would be required of the therapist to divulge. But outside of those very specific circumstances, everything that you talk about, even if you are a minor, you have rights and protections. And so everything that you talk about should be held in confidence between you and that therapist.
Can I add something?
Now, yeah.
I just want
Please.
to say, I think in this consumptive culture of immediate gratification, there's also a part of it that I don't want us to overlook, and that is the devaluing of that process, right? Mm-hmm. So there are people, back when I did personal training, I would say, well, this is my rate. Oh, well, do you teach a class? Well, I do teach classes. I just don't teach classes here, So if you're looking to work with me and you really enjoy working with me, these are my rates. And I would get, that's too expensive. I can't afford that. Mm-hmm. And I would look and go, but the phone in your hand costs a 10-pack of personal training sessions. So you obviously can't afford it. You've just chosen not to pay for it. Mm-hmm. Right? So people want to do this. Oh, well, I can only afford like $10, $15. But what do you mean you can only afford $10, $15 when you pay $20 for a movie ticket? So you prioritize going to see the new Black Panther movie coming out next week, which, yes, I will be in that too.
Yes, I do.
But I'm not going to take my therapy money and go see Black Panther. Right. You see what I'm saying? My therapy money is already set aside. That's my
I'm going to take my latte money and I'm going to go apply that.
That's play money for the weekend. That's what's going to take me up into that $20 movie with that $10 popcorn and all that other stuff, $5 for a thing of water. That's what that's all about. So I think that we also need to value mental health and the process, right?
I think that is essentially fundamentally a big part of the disconnect. Like, we really don't value mental health services. I was at a working conference this past weekend with a bunch of other psychologists in training, and we at one point during the break, we all started kind of lamenting about the plane ride back. And because inevitably, if you say I'm a psychologist or I'm going to school for a PhD in psychology, then the seatmate on the plane ride wants to then take advantage of that captive audience and tell you all about their problems. I have heard about people's marriages falling apart. I've heard about people's troubled kids. I have heard about people's issues with their mother and their father. And I'm like, you don't even know my name, but you asked me what I've done. So we were, making a joke like, just put your headphones on or don't tell people. We've come up with a list of alternative professions that we do that for sure get people to stop talking. I told them that I usually just tell people now, I'm a scholar of social justice and diversity. And like, nobody wants to talk about that in the current political.
Nobody talks to you.
Oh, okay. Nobody talks to me.
She's a feminazi. Don't talk to her.
Shuts them right on up.
Right.
So that happens. Or can I just ask you this real quick? Or the other side of that is people are like, I took a psychology undergrad course. Or I was a psych minor. And
Me
so
too. I know about those dogs. Did Pavlov ever deal with those dogs? Like, are the bells still ringing?
Exactly. And so somebody was like, yeah, I told my they said that their aunt told them, oh, I was a psych major or a minor or something like that. And now her aunt is a practicing attorney. And she told her aunt, yeah, and I watch a lot of Law and Order, so I guess I could probably do your job too, right?
Let me tell you, that SVU, I love that SVU marathon.
I thought of you.
On the weekends. I could be a lawyer today with the number of SV. I have done the clock hours, right? What do they call CEUs? I've done CEUs.
You've done it to pass the bar and to practice law.
Thank you very much.
The answer is no. And I think all of that to me goes back to this idea of like devaluing psychology, devaluing mental health. It's like, oh, anybody can do it. You just got to be a good listener, right?
Right. Or
it's a little bit more
just
complicated.
Because you're a psychologist, you're just sitting up there ready, willing, and able to just talk about people's problems. You know what I used to do when people would say that, when they'd say, what do you do? I said, well, I do music, this, that, but I do personal training. Oh, you're a personal trainer? Well, I've been trying to lose this last 10 pounds, blah, blah, blah. What do you think I should do? This was my standard answer. I think you should hire me as a personal trainer.
I love it.
The conversation ended. Like there was no more to be said. Because if you aren't willing to put your money where your mouth is, I'm not here giving out free advice.
Yeah.
That's not what this is all about. This is an internet. You could read Men's Health or Women's Health magazine if you want the free advice, but even then you got to pay for the mag, right? So you're paying for that. But
you better get your YouTube video though, because I am.
Get you a Jillian Blanks, a Sean T. Get that.
Don't talk about my boo Sean T. Wait a minute.
But don't come to me looking for something for free. No.
Right. So people do. We had to put our money where our values are, and if you really value mental health, then you got to pay for it. And so I think so. And I don't want to be insensitive. So let's talk about the other part, right? So. There's a good portion of Americans that have health insurance, a good portion. We all know that it's not always affordable. We all know that it's not always adequate in lots of ways. And we know we all don't have the same amount of agency in the sorts of health practitioners that we get to go see. So the whole medical health field is fraught with problems. Putting those aside for now, a good portion of Americans do have health insurance. And so I don't know if a lot of people know this, but in 2008, so 10 years now, we had a federal mental health parity bill that got passed. And that bill basically says you have to treat mental health services or mental health health coverage in the exact same way that you treat physical health coverage. So you can't have this differential system for folks who are pursuing services for mental, behavioral, or substance abuse issues than you do for people with physical health. So that means that if you are covered by insurance, you should have access to practitioners that are in your network. And you can pay a copay, just like you pay at your doctor. You can pay a $20 to $25 copay and go see that therapist. So that's an option for a good portion of folks. And I also recognize it's not an option for a lot of folks. There's, I think the health insurance agency, the health insurance world kind of talks about this like as a donut, right? So there's a lot of people that's covered. And there's some folks that are, who financially don't have private insurance, and so their level of socioeconomic status facilitates them having Medicaid, which also covers mental health services. But there are some folks in the middle, right, who make enough to not qualify for Medicaid, but also don't make enough to be able to afford health insurance, or don't make enough to have that level of coverage for health insurance and to be able to afford to pay for that out of pocket. The other piece that I think is important to consider for those kind of folks in the middle is that sometimes those are the people that are most stressed because they are working hourly wages. And so it's a real conversation to be able to have. Like, do I take time out of my work week to go see a mental health practitioner and lose time at work? Or do I go to work and power through and make this money because I have bills to pay and people to feed, et cetera, et cetera. So I want to not like be completely dismissive of the varying ranges that people and challenges that come along with people at different socioeconomic statuses. I think we have to do better in this country, period, for health coverage. And I think mental health coverage should be right along in that conversation as well. I think everybody should have access to quality mental health, just period.
I completely agree.
Now, what you do with that access and whether you use it or not, like, that's a different conversation. I still have strong opinions about that, but I think it should be a fundamental right. And right now it's still being serviced as a privilege.
But let's have a real conversation, if you don't mind, about those people in the middle.
We're not having a real conversation right now?
No, I mean...
It feels real to me.
You're so witty.
So witty.
No, I mean about that specific segment of the middle class that no one wants to acknowledge. The part of the middle class that is too rich for, we're going to call them too rich for Medicaid, but too poor for that Cadillac insurance, right?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of people who fall into that category. And you're right, a lot of them are hourly workers, and going to a mental health professional is losing money and time, two things that they do not have. So what do you see as some options for those people who are in desperate need of those services?
Yeah. So I think, I don't, let me say it this way. I think there are options, and I don't know that they're always the best. So I want to be clear about that. I think that people can take advantage of, so I do know there are some socially conscious mental health practitioners in every community that offer pro bono services. They may not be a huge proportion of their entire business portfolio, but they may offer pro bono services to folks. I know lots of folks that offer sliding scale. So they'll say, like, my rate is $175 an hour. Let's talk about what's realistic for you to afford. Right. And they'll work with people. Again, that's not the largest proportion of their portfolio of services. So those can be an option for folks. If that's not an option, sometimes depending on the level of severity or distress, you may want to talk about going to your mental health professional every other week. Right. So maybe you want to pull out and not go on a weekly capacity, or maybe you go for periods of time, try to take a break and come back. So think differentially about like how you use the services. I think that sometimes people, depending upon what's the reason for seeking services, there may be support groups, there may be self-help groups in your community that you can look up and find. I know that some people, and I'm not promoting this at all because I don't know enough about how they work or what they look like, but there's been this new advent of having mental health apps. So there's one, I think, like called Talkspace. There's another one too that sometimes comes up in my social media feeds that I think provides services as needed on a more reasonable fee base for folks that may not want to go in. So I think there's some options. I don't know. So let me say it this way. I have a bias, and I do think that I have a bias that's rooted in my experiences and rooted in my training that says, like, being able to go to a therapist's office and sit down with someone as a human being face to face and talk through some issues on a regular basis is the optimal approach for mental health. I will say that. And I think that there are things that you can do for caring for yourself and coping and keeping you going forward in a healthy way that aren't that, but can get at some of the things you need. I think also engaging in some of the things that we talked about in our last podcast about really thinking about self-care for yourself and thinking about ways to take care of yourself. I have become increasingly a bigger proponent of doing meditation and thinking about mindfulness. So I think that there are some kind of self-induced strategies that you can use to manage and deal with coping, and manage and deal with issues in a way that's healthy coping that can facilitate some things for you.
What about people who use therapeutic substitutes We spoke earlier about sort of some of the cultural aspects of this, and people who don't want to go because there's a healthy fear and warranted fear because it's completely justified.